Hi, so my name is Anna Molyneux. I am a final year student at the University of Bristol studying veterinary science, as I am wearing on my shirt today. Not that I'm plugging the university at all, but yeah, so I'm a presenter scholar for Medic Mentor. And I'm here to talk to you today just a little bit about work experience and how you can really make the most of it. I think, especially as an applying student, you can feel like you're working a lot trying to get your work experience. It can be quite challenging to get work experience, and so we'll kind of just address a few of these points along the way today. Background generally, I grew up in rural Cheshire. I went to school in Chester, which is in the northwest, and I started doing my work experience when I was about 15 years old, at the beginning of year 11. I started out doing mainly clinical practice and then branched out into doing more animal husbandry, so dairy farming, things like that, and a few extra bits to kind of try and set myself apart from the rest of the group. So that kind of led me to the place where I am now. I'm in my final year, so 6 months away from graduating, which is very exciting. But yeah, so I will delve back into the past and think about when I was an applying student and kind of help hopefully relate some of that to you guys as well. And feel free to submit some questions, which I can hopefully answer towards the end of this webinar. I'll start talking about why vet schools want you to have done work experience. Then we'll start talking about different kinds of work experience, how you can get it, and the different types that are available, whether you can get it to be paid, and also how you can really make the most of it, which is really the crux of all of this. Why do vet schools make you do work experience? I think that is a question a lot of you will probably want to know. Like I said, it really does feel that you are, at least for me, it made me feel like I was working all the time. I can probably honestly tell you I haven't had a proper break from being in the vet profession since I was probably about 16. So that is definitely something to think about when you're getting yourself into this. So they really want to see that you know what you're letting yourself in for as a career. I think that's the main thing here. 5 years into vet school, 20 years into the profession, if you've not realized that it's for you, then it's going to make it even harder. At this point now, I find it hard enough and I like it. So you really want to make sure that this is for you, and it's about getting that exposure, and getting the wide variety of exposure is really important as well. Not just seeing what it's like as a small animal vet in one practice, but seeing maybe what it's like as a small animal vet in multiple practices, or seeing what it's like to be a large animal vet and compare it to an equine vet. Just kind of see what's out there. And I think, as well as learning about the career generally, it's just really start to expose you to how animals are handled and how animals are looked after. Whilst this is something that is taught, obviously, on the course, because different people have different exposures to different animals, depending on where they live, the more you get before you get into vet school, the better, because you're just building that foundation of knowledge. It's also showing willing, I think, in that if you are showing you're giving up your time as a student in your holidays, and you're showing them that you really want this, and when everybody else is competing for a spot, and the statistic that we use, which is from UCAS, is that less than 4% of applicants will get into vet school. So you want to make yourself as competitive as possible. So within reason, you want to get as much work experience as possible, okay? So there we go. That's why vet schools really want you to do work experience. And then that brings me to, what sort of work experience do I do? I mean, there's a lot. You might initially think, vet schools only want me to see what it's like to be a vet. And I actually think that whilst that is the case, and it's good to do that and obviously see what the profession is like, it's very different seeing what it's like to be a vet and actually experiencing it and being more hands-on. And so I like to break this into clinical and non-clinical placements, which is how the universities also break them down once you're in vet school. So the clinical work experience that you could do is mainly within practice, and that's the practice that you've got down the road. It's the big referral centre that's an hour away from you. It's the super vet. It's all of that. That's all clinical practice. And so the first thing that you obviously need to do is get yourself in the door. and just start asking. So that a lot of universities will ask that you have 2 weeks. I think it's pretty standard, probably the average in clinical practice. And for most of you guys, that's going to be easiest to get in small animal just because of the number of practices that there are. And also they're more likely to have the sort of insurance that covers people under the age of 18, which I think the majority of applicants, you could safely say, are. It gets much more difficult getting large animal practice placements because they want you to be over 18, or they want the university's insurance to cover any accidents for health and safety reasons. So yeah, getting that clinical exposure initially might let you see whether you've got a bit of a taste for it, and whether you think I could do this. It's not just cuddling cats and dogs, but I think I could do this. And then I would put much more of an emphasis on, I think personally, when I applied, I put much more of an emphasis on non-clinical placements. And that's what I was saying before in exposure to animals, learning how to handle animals, learning how you look after a healthy animal. I think a lot of people go into vet school or go into applying to vet school being very, very focused on the ill animal. And the first 2-3 years of your course are focusing on the healthy animal. So the more you know when going in, the better. So the best placements to really get first exposure to are things like milking, learning how dairy cows work, especially if you've not grown up on a farm. A lot of people, even if you don't have dogs and cats, will probably more likely to vaguely appreciate how to look after them. It might seem more like common sense to a lot of people because they've been around them in some capacity, whether it's a grandparent or a friend. But dairy cattle, sheep, pigs, all of that extra farm animals, they're much more difficult to get exposure to unless you're in the circle. So I started trying to get milking experience, and obviously I'm from a very rural part of the country in which there were lots of dairy farms, so easier in that sense. I could go and cycle around or drive around and call up a neighbour and be like, oh, can I come and do some dairy with you for a couple of weeks? And you're learning how the industry works. And then that brings us on to my colleague Owen did a webinar a few weeks ago, which is some kind of wider reading within the veterinary profession, knowing kind of what's going on. If you're speaking to farmers, you're going to learn so much more about the industry than if you just read it, because you're experiencing it. You can see what the struggles are for farmers, what they feel they could improve on, how the markets are, everything like that, which, granted, not a lot of people do go into farm medicine in comparison to smalls, but that might be what you actually would be really, really good at. And if you've never had experience with cattle and everything like that before, then you're kind of wasting opportunities. So I would really recommend starting with things like milking and lambing. A lot of universities will like it if you get something a little bit different. If you can get, say for example, I can use myself as an example, which I will keep coming back to, so apologies. But because I lived so rural, I didn't really have an excuse not to get all of that farming experience. I could just walk down the road, it was there. And so I managed to get pig farm experience as well, which can be more difficult, especially with biosecurity on pig farms. But I was able to get a placement there. I also worked on a goat farm as well for a couple of weeks, which was also, again, something a little bit different. And it's good, it can be something that you can talk about at your interview as well. And it just exposes you to something, so much work experience. Sometimes for your own peace of mind, doing something a bit different really helps. Like, you can just get a little bit of exposure, and it can break up that cycle of, if you're not really into cows and sheep, it can break up the monotony of doing something that you're not necessarily really interested in. So that's something else to think about. Other aspects of non-clinical don't necessarily have to be husbandry related. So we talk about also kennels counts. If you don't necessarily have access to farm animals as easily, kennels, catteries, anything like that that gives you exposure to animals. But besides the husbandry, you can also do things in research laboratories, a little bit more niche and obscure perhaps, but I did manage to get a placement at the University of Liverpool when I was 17. And I worked in the histology lab for 2 weeks when it was still in the city. It's now at Lea Hurst. And I had never had exposure to looking down a microscope except for in biology a couple of times maybe, looking at like leaf cells. And this was kind of throwing me in at the deep end, but they were such good teachers. We all sat around this giant multi-headed microscope, and they would show me cancerous tissue that they'd taken from a cat. We did postmortems. Well, they did postmortems, and I stood at a distance whilst they did it. But just things like that, it exposes you to a different aspect of the profession. Because like I said before, you probably go into the profession thinking, I'm going to be a clinical practitioner, but there are so many opportunities within veterinary that you can go into besides clinical practice. And whilst many people start out in clinical practice, the new statistics are saying that like 50% of graduates are not in clinical practice within 5 years. So that's a lot of people moving into different avenues. So it's good to kind of keep your eyes and your mind open as to the different aspects. And it really shows that you're trying to get all different views, different perspectives in the career. So how do you start to decide what options are right for you with work experience? I think that it isn't necessarily a question of what's right necessarily, but what you actually have feasible access to. So depending on where you live can have a really, really big influence on what you can get. I use myself again as an example in that because I lived so rurally, I didn't have an excuse really to not get all that agricultural experience. I was also able to get a large animal medicine placement as well, which was very good. I did some equine work as well, and it is in the area, so it's much easier for me to reach out and get there, and it's within a reasonable distance, especially if a lot of you are under 17 and don't have a driver's license. You can't drive to placements. You're relying on public transport or the kindness of parents, which I definitely can attest to. My mother drove me to all my placements until I was 21 and had a car. So there is, to a point, a degree of parental involvement, but it's very situational dependent. And if you are not in a rural environment, say you're in a city, Manchester, in a city, London, and you don't have access to transport outside of the city, all hope is not lost. Universities do take into account your situation, and the reason why a lot of them have lowered requirements for work experience with the number of weeks is for widening access for those sort of reasons. But you still need to be showing willing, and I think that's really important. If you live in a city, London, and you can get lots of work experience in practices, but maybe not so much with obviously farm animals, you can probably get to a kennels within reason. And obviously London public transport is great. So within reason, kennels, catteries, something that maybe like if you can get something at the zoo, and pet shops, getting a job at Pets at Home, is animal exposure. And it's showing the universities that you are still willing, even if you're not able to travel an hour out of London to go and work on a farm. And that, that is taken into account. But I really want to emphasize this, you have to show willing. And, there are opportunities for paid work experience as well. I worked at a local vet practice as a receptionist for about 18 months, which was really, really good for me. I just worked on a Saturday. It was 3.5 hours. It doesn't sound like much, but, it was extra money in my pocket because I wasn't working otherwise. And I'm still getting exposure to both client communication, which is so important and is really, really emphasized in vet school. Like, it will be hammered into you by the time you're final year, and you won't realize how important it is until you are doing consultations in your final year. So getting that client communication starting now is really, really, really good. As well, yeah, like I said, Pets at Home, your pet shops, your local pet shop, just getting used to talking to people, learning about animals, learning what's kind of normal when you're looking after those animals. So all things like that. But paid work experience is definitely available. Milking jobs if you're living rurally. A lot of farmers are keen for extra help, and if you do an unpaid placement with them, who knows whether that will lead to paid work. If you're really trying, if they like you, you're making an effort. I'm not saying that obviously this will happen in every case, but you're on their radar, you're on their list. And if you're like, oh, I'm actually looking for a Saturday job, I don't know if you've got anything available, or, oh, I'm hoping to work throughout the summer, I don't suppose you know anybody who has a dairy farm I could work on, then they're opening all of these doors for you all the time. And networking is such a big part of getting work experience and getting interesting work experience, and really expanding your network now, because who knows where you'll be in 10 years time. Kennels will also, you can also apply for jobs and things like kennels, little stables as well. I know a lot of vet applicants are keen riders, so I'm sure a lot of you riding bunch will probably already have jobs at the stables, but that again is exposure to animals, and which is just really, really, really important. So with regards to making the most of your work experience, I think that this is a very personal thing. I can give you guidelines into how I did it and how I think is most effective for other people, having spoken to all of my friends as well, who either graduated or are in their final year. But it is very much applying yourself. You shouldn't view work experience as a box ticking exercise. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that universities will see through it as well, to a point, because if they see that you've gone to 20 weeks of work experience placements, on paper, you'll probably look amazing. But then if you look at your personal statement and you've not really talked about how you learn anything from it, when you go for interview, if you get called for interview, they ask you about something really specific on that placement that they know that you've probably seen, and you kind of zone out and don't really seem like you know what you're talking about, they'll be able to see through that. So applying yourself is probably the most important piece of advice I can give you. It's being engaged, asking questions. People feel I always feel like I'm being really annoying when I ask questions, because I know I ask a lot of questions, and the fear of the stupid question is so real. I totally get it. I'm on clinics now and something will come in and I'm like, this is such a stupid question. And actually, even if you ask a question and they turn it back on you and you get it wrong, you're probably more likely to learn from the things you get wrong than from the things that you get right. So I ask questions, but obviously gauge the time in which you do ask questions, because if you're in a put to sleep consultation and you start asking questions, it's probably not the most sensitive time. But then that's also a skill that you learn on work experience, is how to gauge a room, how to gauge your client, and how to gauge your colleagues, which are all very, very important skills that you will continue to develop in vet school as well. So besides applying yourself, I would say challenge yourself. Maybe you are terrified of horses. Maybe you've never been around horses ever, but they absolutely terrify you. Do a stables placement. It probably won't be the funnest thing in the world, but you're going to have to touch a horse if you're going to go into vet school. Doesn't mean you have to be an equine vet, but you do have to do equine rotation. You do have to do equine handling practicals. So it's better to do it now, get that exposure up, get your confidence up, and you can talk about that in your personal statement. You can talk about that in your interview. You can say how you've been pushing yourself because you know that this is something that you need to change, and that shows real personal strength as well. So challenges are really, 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 really good. Even if that's things like, challenging yourself to stay that extra bit of time, help that vet out, because that is going to really put you up there. And when you ask for reference, they'll probably remember the things that you did to help them as well. I personally found it very good to keep a work experience journal. I kept one probably I don't think it was my first placement, but I realized how useful it would be after that. So I kept a journal, which I probably still have at home, that I dated my placements at, and I wrote in it every day. And maybe that's a bit excessive, but definitely every few days, every time you see something that is a little bit different, as well as the things that are routine, because actually the reality of things, the routine things, are obviously the things that you see more often. So you might sit there and see 10 cat stays or 10 cat castrates in a week in practice. And you might see, one tail amputation, for example. You might think, oh, that tail amputation is really, 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 really interesting. It's really different. It's so cool. So maybe to an interview, or you're thinking about the veterinary profession generally, the number of tail amputations that vets will probably do is much lower than cat spays and cat neuters. So you need to be engaging with the routine things as much as the interesting, cool things, because they're the things that you're more likely to get quizzed on, and you're more, it's just more accurate, So I would write all of your, everything that you see, things that went well, things that didn't go quite so well, what you'll do next time. And it's all kind of part of this reflective cycle. So for anyone that came to the National Healthcare Weekend, we talked about reflective thinking. Things like the Gibbs reflective cycle, or P, are some of the options which you can Google and find, and it lists all the things. And they're really good things to follow, in the fact that, you know, you assess what you're going to do, then you reflect on what you did, and you say how you're going to improve next time, and then you put that into action. And that's what you do as a clinician every day. You know, things don't go well all the time. Hopefully they go well most of the time, but you know, it's going to chop and change. So you need to just be constantly self-evaluating and reflecting on what goes well and what doesn't. And so that'll be really good practice if you can show that you're doing that when you're going into an interview. You see that you're being very pragmatic and you're really reflective, and it's a really, really good skill to have. And it means that they don't have to teach you it quite so much, and it's not quite as frustrating when you're in third year and they start trying to teach you it, because you'll already be using those skills. So I would keep that journal for every single placement that you do, and you can then use that to build your personal statement. Start picking out those really important days that you had. So those that didn't go quite so well, those things, the day that you had the epiphany that this is what you wanted to do in 7 years, that you wanted to be a qualified vet and you want to be doing X, Y, and Z. But yeah, also the things that are hard, because then again, it's showing that you've got that really clear view of the profession, and how it can be difficult, but it can also be extremely rewarding. So hopefully you get both aspects of that. I would also, so I've talked quite a bit about context of interview, and that is a really important thing to focus on, I think. Obviously, you don't want to be really, really bogged down thinking about an interview and the way that it makes your interview answers false. But everything that you kind of see in practice, you have to really think about it. Don't just let it happen. Don't just, like I said, don't just watch that cat castrate. Think about what that vet's doing. Ask the vet what they're doing. You know, are they providing pain relief? What sort of pain relief is there? Obviously, they're not expecting you to know, like, anesthesia. They're not expecting you to know everything, but they're expecting you to have engaged and have asked those questions, maybe gone home and looked some things up. They're not expecting you to be experts. It's just that it's to show that you're curious. So that's really, really, really important. Engage with your work experience, and think about all of those interview questions you could get. So for example, I can give you a few examples of what I had in my Bristol interview. I was asked to describe an operation that I had seen from beginning to end. And actually, I think that this shows that my advice is probably going to really help you, in that the first thing that came to my mind when they said describe an operation, I thought, well, what operation do I see all the time? And for me, that is, I would say a cat castrate, or a bitch spay, or a cat spay. And when I was trying to think about how they did it, I had absolutely no idea. I'd probably seen 50 cat castrates, at least, because I'd done so many weeks of work experience. And I could not describe it. And, you know, at the time, I'm kicking myself, thinking I should have engaged way more, I should have done all this. And actually, cat castrate maybe not so much, but cat spays and bitch spays are actually quite complex. Or at least they can be. And so actually not knowing that you're tying off a specific ligament within the abdomen isn't that bad. And I probably could have done it. But the first thing I thought of was a cow hoof amputation, which I'd seen once, but was actually quite easy to describe because it had really stayed in my mind, because I was more engaged, because it was something different. And I think they were quite surprised when I started talking about that, but I could talk about pain relief. They asked me specifically about pain relief and, you know, what were the pros and cons of doing something like this? And maybe I hadn't asked those questions, but I was able to think about the situation and use my other work experience that wasn't necessarily farm to guide me in my answer, thinking, well, I'd asked a similar question in small animals and they'd said this. So maybe it's something like this. And it's forming those kind of educated, I wouldn't say educated guesses, but educated answers that might not be right. So it's just really important to kind of get in that mindset now, and then you're really analysing everything that you're doing really efficiently. Another really, really important thing to do is to ask for references, I think. There is a mixed consensus about how important references are sometimes, and I always think it's better to have a reference than to not have a reference. So when you go, hopefully get called for interview, fingers crossed, you may be asked to supply a work experience questionnaire, or it might be beforehand. You have to send it off with your UCAS. It's very dependent on the university, and granted, things have changed a little bit since when I applied. So I took a folder of my references to my interview, just in case they wanted to verify anything, because you can sign anything you want on that work experience form. And actually, you could make up a name. You could just make it up, and actually, it's very easy to think, maybe they won't verify it, maybe I could just lie on this, but just don't do that. If you have a reference, you're backing everything you've got up. You've got that there, and they don't even need to bother calling anybody. You've just got that. You've got a signed reference from the vet's practice that you've been a receptionist at. You've got a signed reference from the farm vet that you went to practice with. And actually, having that folder full of your references can make you feel quite good as well. It can be a really good confidence boost, because hopefully you applied yourself in your work experience, you've tried really, really hard, you've been really engaged, and all your references are shining and they're lovely, and everyone, they're saying, Sophie's a joy to work with, she's always really committed, she's always on time, she's really committed to patient care, all that sort of thing. And if you've got 10 references that say that, you start to really believe that you're going to be a really good applicant and you're going to be a really good vet. And you're like, I can do this. So I would always say ask for references. With references, it's best to ask for them at the end of your time on your placement, or towards the end of your time, mainly because if you go back, say you do, I know that there's this rule now that I think you have to have done all of your work experience within 3 years of applying to uni. It is important to not go back maybe a year later and be like, oh, by the way, I'm applying for vet school now. Can you write me a reference? Because the volume of people that come through vet practices on placements, whether it's vet students or pre-vet students, is so high. It's really, really, really high. So the best thing to do is get it sooner whilst you're fresh in their mind. Otherwise, they're probably not going to remember why you were great. They might remember that you were like, yeah, I think she was okay, I can't, but an okay reference is nowhere near as good as a great reference. So do that then and chase them up. Don't be afraid to nag these clinicians, because the thing is, they're really busy. So, they might forget. But all it takes is to call up, leave a message at reception, be like, oh, I asked for a reference. Could you just, give the vet a little nudge? And they'll be absolutely fine with that. Email is a great thing as well. So they can just email it, attach it, and you can print it off. Just make sure that they're signed. A few of us were discussing fact that sometimes farmers might ask you to write your own reference, which they will sign. I mean, that is maybe one of those things that happens. I've never had to do that, and I would not necessarily recommend it. I wouldn't recommend saying, oh, by the way, I've written a reference, can you sign it? That's not good. Don't do that, because then they will write you a reference and be like, she's a little bit shady, so wouldn't recommend. But, if that situation does come up, use your best judgment. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, really, really, really press the farmer and say, I would really appreciate if you just write a line. All it needs to be is a line. And I think that something's really important with this whole reference fraud kind of thing is that your signature means everything. Once you're a vet student, once you're a practitioner, one wrong signature and it can end your career. So the best thing to do is be honest from the get-go. I really wouldn't recommend writing your own references, even if they ask you to. Just ask really politely, please, can you just write me one line to say that I turned up from these dates and I was okay, because that's going to be worth more. I just always think that, the one day that you do it, at least if this was me, the one day that I would write a fraudulent reference would be the day that someone found out. And you'll know people that get away with it, but it's just not worth it. Just don't do it, okay? It's my one golden piece of advice. So, asking for references and everything that we just talked about. Something that's really important to bear in mind is that your work experience does not end when you get into university. I have alluded to the fact that I've continued doing placements throughout university, and this has actually not been of my own accord. So I haven't thought, I'm going to make myself really competitive as a graduate, and I'm going to spend all of my holiday time in practices or on farms. It's actually a requirement. So our governing body as veterinary surgeons is the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, or the RCVS. And the RCVS requires that between your first, well, at least with Bristol, you have to do preclinical EMS. We call it extramural studies, which is synonymous with work experience, just what you call it when you get to uni. So we have to complete 12 weeks of preclinical EMS and 26 weeks of clinical EMS. So at Bristol, I know lots of the universities do this a little bit differently, but in Bristol we have to do those preclinical weeks, so 12 weeks between Easter of first year and the first day of third year. So obviously you have your summer, you have your Easter, and you have your Christmas break of second year, and you have to fit those 12 weeks in. And that all has to get signed off. There's various forms that need to get filled in by the people that you go and see practice with. And then from day one of your third year until the day that your exams happen, in final year, you have to complete an extra 26 weeks of clinical EMS. And that all happens in veterinary practices. It's all clinical, whether that is research, clinical research, or practice. But then the preclinical weeks are all husbandry based, with a couple of weeks of vet practice on the side as well. So something that is really important with your work experience is that this doesn't just open doors for getting into vet school. It opens doors throughout vet school. So you can go back to that same dairy farm to go and do your 2 weeks of dairy. You can go back to that lambing farm and do 3 weeks of lambing with them. And actually, it makes your life so much easier if you already have these connections. In my first and second year, I only had to go, I think, to one place that I'd never been to before. And I didn't have to go there. I just decided I wanted to do something different. I went back to the same dairy farm. I actually got sent to a sheep farm. Bristol used to just kind of assign you to farms around the country and go, off you go lambing. So I did go to a different lambing farm. But I did, milking at the same place. I did my vet practice at the same place. And it's just, I went back to the stables that I used to ride at. You know, it means that you don't have that day one feeling again, which I think is really, really nice, especially when vet school is hard. Having to go and do placements in your spare time is really, really hard. So just going somewhere and not having to be stressed about the first day makes the world of difference. Really, really, really does. You can go back to that vet practice that you do preclinical EMS at in your third year and beyond. And who knows whether that practice is going to, you know, mentor you to the point where they want to hire you. You know, it's all very much based on networking. And the vet community is very, very small. Do not offend people, maybe, because you never know where they're going to be when you're looking for a job. But it's very, very important to kind of keep these channels open. So it kind of starts now, like your veterinary journey does start now in building these connections. And people who you meet on work experience as well, make friends with them. I have met people on EMS placements during vet school who have seen practice on my other friend from vet school's farm. And, you know, they'll go to Nottingham and I'll go to Bristol, and we'll just meet and we have all these mutual friends. And it means that kind of when you go out into practice, the people that you've met before and aren't really sure why you know them. And the various, you know, events that we have that are held across vet schools, like congresses and sports weekends, you know, you start to meet people and you start to recognize a lot of faces. So I'd really use your work experience opportunity as a time to really start making friends. And actually, a really, really important note that I haven't said yet, nurses are your best friends. That is paramount. Never go in to a practice as a vet student or as a pre-vet student and think that you are above the nurses, because you know what? There'll be one day where you can't do something and the nurses will be able to do it for you. They are amazing. Make friends with them. I can't say that enough. And you know what? You know, you might go into practice as a pre-vet student and think, oh, but you know, I don't want to be a vet nurse. I want to be a vet. Actually, you're probably going to get better exposure to animal handling, which, like I said before, is paramount. animal care, patient care, you know, empathy, all those sort of things. Start to recognizing like what's wrong with the animal and how they can fix it, because nurses are usually more heavily involved in inpatient care than the vets are, because the vets will work up that case, find out what's wrong with it, or at least stabilize the animal, and then they have to go and see other animals. So it's left in charge of vet nurses as much as it is of the vets. So actually spending time with nurses, making friends with nurses is really, really important. That's another top tip. I've already said I have a top tip, but this is another one. So I 100% nurses are your friends, never offend them. They are there, they are your support network. Especially if you go back as a vet student, they will help you place those IV catheters, they will help you take blood, they will be there every step of the way, whereas the vets will be back in the consult room. So that is super important. And I think I've pretty much touched on this, but really my take home point is help each other out. If there's somebody in your school, your high school, your college, who also wants to be a vet student, don't sit there and think, oh, well, there's only 4% of us are going to get places. I don't want you to be my competition. I don't want to help you. You have to help each other, because this is where this network begins. This is, you will get through vet school with the help of your friends and your colleagues. Vet school is hard. I feel like I've said that a lot, but vet school's really hard, and they tell you it's hard. And I remember thinking, oh, the hardest part of vet school is probably going to be getting in, and it's not. It's staying in, and it's it's staying happy whilst you're in vet school. It is tough, and if you can help your friends now, and you have that solidarity, it's going to really help. I had a friend who applied to vet school the same year as me. There was 3 of us in my 6th form that were applying, out of about a year of 60, if that. So that was quite high for my high school. And if we hadn't helped each other with placements, none of us would have probably got in. So, I did an abattoir placement with a girl from my year. An extra boost for both of our CVs. They're not looking, vet schools aren't going to put the 2 of you on the table and think, well, which one do we want more? They might do that, but the likelihood of that happening is so low, because, it's not just you against your best mate, it's you against thousands of other people, So it's just trying to set yourselves apart from the group, not necessarily set yourself apart from each other. So you really just need to look after each other, help each other out, If your friend knows somebody who has a stables and you're really struggling to get stables work experience, ask them. You've got to start losing shame now, because I can tell you, you need to just pull on every string you have to get placement. Especially when, like I said before, a lot of you are under 18 and might find it difficult to get placements in clinics. Sometimes it's just someone who knows someone who knows someone. That's how I got my farm veterinary experience, is because my mum went to school with somebody who was best friends with a farm vet, and just sending one email being like, oh, by the way, hi, I want to be a vet student, and my mum knows this person who knows you, meant that I didn't have to go through the work experience application system, which required me to be 18 or over, and I just went in the farm truck with him. And maybe that's not health and safety compliant, but that was my way of getting a week. So it's kind of what strings you can pull, and that's where this whole networking thing really comes into play, is that you'll meet somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. I went and did my dairy placement, and I was really struggling to find lambing experience, despite the fact that I lived in the middle of lots of sheep farms. And by asking someone I just met, who worked on a dairy farm, was like, oh, I have a flock, you can come lamb with me. It's as easy as that, and every situation is different. Maybe, you'll go to a dairy farm and you won't find someone that has a sheep farm, but it's doors that open doors that open doors. And that is really, really, really important. So that really concludes all I have to say about making the most of your work experience. I'm going to see whether there are any questions, so just bear with me for a second. But if there aren't, then I will sign off. This webinar will be available on Medic Mentor if you want to watch it again. If you weren't watching when I was live, then I hope you've enjoyed it when you've watched it later. So that's really great. So basically, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I will be signing off. Thank you so much for listening, and if you want to ask any of the mentors any questions, you can find us on medicmentor.com. And so we can answer any of your questions. Just find us in the mentor directory, and you can find any of us there with some groups. I set up a group for small animal veterinary medicine, so if I can start posting some articles that might be good for wider reading, if any of you are interested. Man, just start a conversation. But yeah, just contact Medic Mentor at any point if you have any more questions. Okay, thank you so much for listening. Bye.